Ditton Junction, a deserted and derelict railway station, opened on May the 1st, 1871 and closed on May the 27th, 1994. In actual fact, the original Ditton station was opened in 1852 and was sited further down the track, somewhere where the old Mill House pub was. But when the viaduct was built over the River Mersey between Widnes and Runcorn to extend rail links towards the south, the station was resituated here. By all accounts, this was because with the additional lines and the additional points, there needed to be some distance between the bottom of the viaduct and the station. In those long gone days of the 19th century, it probably served a small rural community, but it became a centre point for rail travel. And the 5 platforms there, and the goods yard on the far side, are indeed testimony to what once was. A man who worked here as a porter in the 1950s tells me of when the morning passenger trains were slowing to stop, how rows of carriage doors would swing open before hordes of workers converged onto the platforms, then bustle their way up the steps, through the old booking office, then dispersed to their various workplaces in Widnes and Hale Bank. One's imagination could wander endlessly, I suppose, when thinking of all the people who must have used this station in its 123-year lifespan, and indeed their reasons for doing so. I know of one elderly woman whom in the 1930s would board daily a morning train to St Helens to go to her school there. In 1969, a friend of mine went for trials with Wrexham Football Club, and he'd travel there via a train from here to Chester. In 1984, Prince Charles, no less, got off here when he visited the town of Widnes. The station, which was then being run down, was temporarily refurbished just for the royal visit. But as I stand here today, for some strange reason, I think back to the Great War of 1914 to 18, with its nightmare images of the trenches. Because no doubt some local soldier lads waited there for a train to go to some army or regimental base before going off to fight in France, and never came back. The platform nearest to us, where the line has long since been pulled up, is platform 1. And that is where from the train, known in local legend as the Ditton Dodger, commuted between here and St Helens for many, many years before being withdrawn from service in 1951. A decade before the notorious Dr. Beeching came along to axe so many services and stations. Though going into the 1960s, excursions and specials still departed from that platform. In 1961, Widnes Rugby League team played in a famous Challenge Cup tie at Knowsley Road, St Helens. And some supporters of the team travelled to the game from here. The game, just for reference, was drawn. And in the replay at Norton Park, Widnes Rugby League Club recorded a record attendance of 24,000 spectators, a record which still stands to this very day. Platforms 4 and 5 is where from these services to Warrington Bankey Low Level and beyond into the suburbs of Manchester departed from and returned to. Those services were withdrawn in 1962 as Dr. Beeching's Stalin-like purges began to unfold. Those services went on the line through Widnes. The line through Widnes is still in use as a freight line, though perhaps for not much longer, given that only a few trains per day use it now. The centre platforms 2 and 3 is where the Lime Street to Chester return service used to stop to pick up passengers. That service was reduced and finally phased out in 1975. This left Ditton Junction with only a Lime Street to Crewe return service. And when that was reduced to a peak hour only service in 1979, the station from then on was living on borrowed time. Of course, one cannot stand by a station like this without reflecting on the great days of the steam engines. The steam age probably reached its height in terms of traction power and beauty of design just before the Second World War, and in popularity just after. How those keen young train spotters would come around this station to see those expresses thundering through in all their glory. The Shamrock, the Merseyside Express, the Manxman, the Red Rose, hauled by those elegant engines that were the Princess class, or by those magnificent and burly engines that were the Coronation class, or perhaps a Royal Scot or a Jubilee. I can just imagine one coming down now from Speke Junction, or coming off the viaduct and bursting through that tunnel there. The porter, whom I've already referred to, tells me that the station seemed to almost quake when they came through, and was often engulfed in smoke that would linger long after they had stormed onwards to either Liverpool or London. And at times there would be an almost endless procession of freight trains, clanking, chugging, struggling their way through, hauled by Black 8s, Black 5s, and a whole variety of other engines, each well known to the keen train spotter. Train spotting was such a popular hobby in days gone by that there was a newsagent just halfway down the bridge there that actually used to stock logbooks such as this. And this is one that I purchased in 1964 as a young boy. Of course, the young boys of 1997 are much more likely to be interested in Oasis, computers and all the gadgets of the high-tech age than trains. And who can blame them? Because the slick electric intercities that fizzle through here now do little for me either. Actually, the electrics were first starting to come through here as far back as 1962, when the Liverpool to Crewe line was electrified. And this was the first stage in electrifying the line all the way down to London Euston. And this marked the beginning of the end of the steam age. At about the same time, Ditton Junction was completely rebuilt and modernised. The fact that such an undertaking was implemented indicates just how busy and viable the station was going into the 1960s. It is noteworthy, however, that a car park for commuters was not included in the modernisation plans. Perhaps back then it was assumed that people would actually walk to a railway station when they wanted to travel by train. It is also noteworthy that it was undecided at the time as to whether to stop the new electric-hauled Liverpool-London expresses here or at Runcorn. The latter was eventually chosen. Almost certainly, those two decisions with regard to the car park and the Liverpool-London expresses contributed to Ditton Junction's long-term decline and eventual closure.
Going much further back in time, there was a disaster at Ditton Junction in the year 1912. Curiously, this was the very same year that one of the greatest and most famous disasters of the 20th century occurred. On April the 15th, the White Star liner, the reputedly unsinkable Titanic, foundered on its maiden voyage. Just 5 months later, on the evening of September the 17th at about 6:30, a train returning from the Welsh coast was coming off the viaduct and reputedly travelling at 60 miles per hour. It was about to pass through the station when it derailed and smashed into the buttress of the bridge. And this is how the approach to the station from the viaduct and the bridge would have appeared at that time. Fire ripped through the first two carriages, as they were mostly of wooden structure in those days, and 15 people were killed, some of them burned to death. The news of this horrific crash spread across the country, and we can see here the headlines from one of the national newspapers, the Daily Sketch. And now we can see the headlines from the local newspaper, the Widnes Weekly News. And the report commences: a railway disaster of a magnitude unparalleled in southwest Lancashire and approached only by such calamities as those at Hawes Junction, Salisbury and Shrewsbury occurred on Tuesday evening at the Ditton Junction of the London and North Western Railway, 2 miles from Widnes and Runcorn and 10 from Liverpool. An express train loaded with holiday makers returning from the Welsh coast fouled the point as far as can now be ascertained when travelling down the incline of Runcorn Viaduct into the junction. And we will now read some further excerpts from the report. The great force with which the engine came into contact with the bridge reduced it to a shapeless mass of metal. The front was completely torn off, and the steel plates on the front were bent back like so much tin. The engine was thrown bodily over on its side. Its tender crashed into it, closing up the space occupied by the footplate, and thus pinning Robert Hughes of Llandudno Junction, the driver, and George Lunn, who also resided at Llandudno Junction. Meanwhile, the whole of the medical men in the Widnes, Runcorn and Garston districts responded to the appeal for assistance sent over the telephone. Nurses and charitably inclined ladies poured into the station from every quarter. With them were the clergy of the Church of England, Catholic priests, Sisters of Mercy and Salvation Army officers, and the work of relieving and consoling went forward apace. When between 30 and 40 injured filled the waiting rooms, the London Express to Liverpool was signalled. It was pulled up in the station and utilised as a relief train. All the injured who had been extricated up to that time were placed therein for conveyance to Liverpool hospitals. The 2 guards' vans were quickly filled, and further vans were attached to the train. The charred carriages were backed onto the siding and were visited this morning by thousands of people. The large heaps of wreckage were carefully searched by the police. In the waiting room mortuary was a high hill of clothing, amongst which was a pale case to the value, it is stated, of £500. The gruesome task of laying out the bodies was performed by a large staff of policemen and nurses. The agonised expression on the faces of the dead was terrible to witness. The number of holiday makers on the train was shown by the twisted frames of bicycles taken from the wreckage. A baby girl had a marvellous escape from death. She was held tightly by her dying mother, uninjured amidst the first coach debris, and is now being cared for by the Ditton residents. The first vehicle was the horse box, containing 2 hackneys, probably proceeding to Liverpool for sale, and was reduced to matchwood. One of the animals was killed, whilst the second, marvellous to relate, scrambled out of the wreckage and trotted up the line. On examination, it was found to be scarcely scratched, and was lodged in a neighbouring stable. Practically every denomination in the Widnes district was represented by its clergy and ministerial staff at the scene of the disaster. Some stayed until the small hours of the morning, and others returned to the scene early on Wednesday morning. A bedraggled, torn and grimy figure, bleeding from the head, was seen rushing across country from the junction immediately after the accident. It transpired that he had escaped from one of the wrecked carriages and was hurrying to Hough Green station to catch a train to Liverpool that his relatives might know he was alive. And the report concludes, the King sent the following message to Sir Gilbert Claughton, Chairman of the London and North Western Railway. The King is greatly distressed to hear of the terrible railway accident on your line, resulting in the loss of so many lives. His Majesty wishes to be informed how the injured are progressing. And now we see the aftermath of the crash.
On a much happier note, some people will always associate Ditton Junction Station with that great period in the history of Widnes Rugby League Football Club between 1975 and 1984, when the team appeared in 7 Challenge Cup finals at Wembley Stadium. Naturally, Many of the townspeople wanted to follow the team to Wembley. And on those cup final mornings, a whole host of Wembley specials departed from the station. And that bridge up there was an absolutely incredible and unbelievable sight. It was an absolute mass of people queuing to get aboard one of the specials that were waiting in the station. It was a sea of black and white, rosettes, scarves, banners, flags, you name it. I asked a local photographer recently, had he any photographs of that bridge on those cup final mornings? And he told me he hadn't got any because he was busy queuing to get aboard one of the specials himself. And that for me summed it all up, because it seemed as if the whole town of Widnes was queuing to get aboard one of those specials. It was as if the whole town of Widnes was being evacuated like in the war, or as if there was some great exodus like those described in the Bible. For many Widnesians, it became an almost annual pilgrimage to that shrine of Wembley Stadium. I recall in particular the 1977 final. The queue must have been what seemed like half a mile back. It probably wasn't quite that far, but it was well back down there to Hale Road, and we were 4 or 5 abreast, and we were shuffling our way ever so slowly forward to the booking office on top of the bridge, the entrance to the station. And when we eventually got there, I discovered I'd lost my ticket for the train, and I had to go home and watch the match on television. I was cursing my luck. In the evening, those packed specials would all return to the station, and some of the younger supporters, like myself at the time, would come straight out the station, straight down this brew, and straight into a club at the bottom there called the Castaways. And they spent the rest of the evening in that